Hello, quick little review here for Two Point Hospital. Two Point Hospital is a simulation game. Basically, you're in charge of managing a hospital, similar to how you might manage a park in Sim Park or how you might manage a city in Sim City. And this sort of simulator genre is one in which I honestly don't think there's a lot of players in this space. There's probably I don't know, maybe five that come to mind. And we've seen some pretty creative, I think, takes on the genre. So one that I think put quite particular acclaim was Mini Metro, which sort of took a really reductive approach and found real beauty in the simplicity of just having like one or two things that you had to manage. And so Mini Metro, obviously, a very clear 5 out of 5. An incredible game, and I'm sure it's won just a crazy amount of awards. Uh, However, when people talk about some of the more built-up versions in this genre, so something with a little bit more meat to it, like something more similar to SimCity, it is often mentioned that City Skylines is sort of the big bad boy on campus there, and that it's in many ways surpassed SimCity, some people have said. And while I think City Skylines has, I think, streamlined some parts of the process, I did feel that City Skylines was really bad in some respects. I think it had a particularly horrendous tutorialization. In fact, I think, frankly, there was no tutorial, or it was so in the background that we talk about emergent tutorialization as in like it's not supposed to impede the user experience. Well, it was like it was not impeding the user experience to the point that like I was falling off a cliff and like exploding, and the game was just doing a terrible job to guide me through that. So I had a really bad experience with that, and the reason why I wanted to start this review with that background is because I think Two Point Hospital stands apart in that its tutorial is amazing. It has a really great user intro experience, bringing the player on. The only complaint I have about the on ramp is it's a little bit too slow. After I think you've cleared 2 or 3 locations, it branches out and then it gives you 3 different locations. But at that point, I already found myself a little bit bored, and so I'm at that part around now, and so I'm about 3 hours in, and I would say at about 3 hours in, it's time to put this down. So this game, is a really strong game, though. I think there's certainly, again, an appeal for people who want to go from start to finish, really getting their hospital just set up in the beginning, and then focusing on all the optimizations and then making it look really beautiful at the same time. I find that with these games, there's often two different like gameplay stuff that's happening. I forget who came up with this, but when we think about gameplay, where we're thinking about it in the context of loops and arcs, where a loop is something that the player does again and again and again, and an arc is sort of a progression that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so in the case of Two Point Hospital, the loop is, well, one of the loops is creating your hospital, getting stars, and then once you finish your hospital, you move on to a new hospital. And then you do the whole process again, where you're creating the hospital, you get the stars, and then you move on. And so that's the loop, where the arc might be within the process of just creating one hospital. You might need to first create your nurses station, and then your doctors, and then your janitors. And you're setting this up so that we have the arc of one hospital, and then sort of that arc feeds into the next loop. So that's one way that I think traditionally we've thought about gameplay. But I think there's another important distinction here, particularly in this genre, where we're dealing with sort of creating a system, and then we have these emergent gameplay moments. So when I talk about a system, I mean in SimCity or one of these other games, you're creating maybe electricity, where you need to get all the electricity to a region. You've got to set up the grid, and once you've set up the system, it's pretty much good. Probably the best sim game I've ever played, Caesar IV. The whole idea there is, you've got to work on your trade flows, where's the workers going to produce the agriculture, where are they going to sell it, and then once you've set up that flow, The only time you really need to get back into that flow is if you realize, okay, maybe it's taking too long for him to get to there, so you need to do an optimization on that. But for the most part, if that flow is there, it's gonna keep going around a circle on itself, and it'll be fine. Whereas there's a different kind of gameplay moment where you have to react to these sort of emergent situations. And so SimCity and SimPark both did this really well. And I think that genre, I think those games really pull ahead of Two Point in this respect, which is that it didn't have a lot of sort of emergent situations that you had to deal with. So in SimCity, you might have an alien attack or a forest fire, or something like that, and then the player will have to sort of pause their arc progression and react immediately to the here and now. And all those loops could be affected by this, or you may need to just sort of see the game in a different light and reprioritize what's going on. And I feel like it's a really compelling moment in the player story experience. However, Two Point doesn't really have that. You're really focused on sort of getting the doctors here, getting the doctors there. There aren't as many sort of like emergent experiences, at least to the extent that I've seen. There was some fun challenges, and I think the closest they got to that was I had one challenge in particular where I had to go squish some bugs that would pop up on the screen, and so it did touch a different part of my brain. It was a very different kind of mini game, and so that was nice. But I would say for the most part, that's where this game is sort of lacking. It's, if you love getting into the zone and just worrying about the long term progression and setting things up and optimizing it so that it's fine, I think you'll enjoy this game. But if you need a little bit more of I guess a little bit more like surprise and change and variety in order to keep you invested and want to do the whole loop again, then I think this game is going to become a little bit boring for you. Now, there's a really interesting thing which I think is quite innovative, which is that they have a bit of a social feature here. And I'm curious to what degree it's had success, because I don't have, all my friends connected on Steam. But the social feature here is that you can work towards these technologies in a collaborative manner. So, for example, if you're familiar with the tech tree from Civilization, we have to study, pyrotechnics and then gunpowder, and then you can create the musket. Well, they have something like that where it's a tech tree, but you need to work on something, and then some of your other buddies need to work on something, and you can all collaborate on this tech tree to build technologies that will affect all the different players who are playing. And so I got to experience that a little bit. Obviously, I'm getting into this game quite a bit late, but I would say that was a really fascinating new mechanic and not something I'd seen before. So I love this idea of clans and community goals, and for long-term engagement, there's rarely anything that's superseded, that's come after them. There's rarely anything better than a true community engagement than having something like a clan or a collective goal. So I think that's fascinating, and it's really awesome to see that in this genre, which I think has traditionally been a little bit handcuffed to the single player medium. And so I think seeing something like a multiplayer SimCity, that could be really awesome. Engaging how does your economy affect these other economies could be interesting. I think one of the struggles that we would have experienced in this is just that a SimCity is normally sort of a sit-down, session-based experience, where for a lot of these clan things to work, you need to have sort of multiple logins per day, and sort of less of I'm going to sit down and really focus on the city, and more of a little bit of I'm going to be pruning. When we talk about gardening, we talk about, planting, which is a very time-intensive situation, and it sort of all happens right at once. And then we talk about pruning, where you're visiting these plants, and you're really just doing a little touch-up every here and there, maybe every once a week, or even less than that. So there's a balance there. In this game right now, I think that social feature, in order for it to work, you really do need a pruning kind of game versus a planting kind of game. And so I think that's one of the difficulties that a designer would come up with, and in the player progression, I think that could be a little bit of a limiting factor if we want to have the player coming back and back, because I'm not coming back, and I think it would be different if it was a mobile game and it was spread out over many smaller instances. I think when we think, what's nice about this game though is that the cities are pretty small, right? So the if we take cities as like the smallest level unit, and here, for example, that would be building a single hospital. I would say that the time to build a single hospital is around 1 hour, and I think they've done a really good job of tuning that and getting it to a good section. I would find though that this is sort of a tangent note, but with respect to tuning, I found that when I, as a player, really wanted to go in and optimize stuff, I didn't find that there was enough information in order for me to do so. I found that, like, if I would throw somebody to go work in a certain hospital room, he might leave based on what the need is, and that really frustrated me, particularly in a case where I had to go against the grain. So I had one challenge where I had to collect 3 ghosts, and this was a pretty big challenge for me because none of my players were dying. And so this is actually, so we'll pause here for a second because I actually want to talk about the humor of this game, which is that it's really good. It's really spot on. This game is really funny. It has a lot of like weird, quirky, like symptoms that you have to cure patients for. So, for example, there's clowns, and so the clowns will come in and they have too much humor, and so there's a dehumorifier that you have to give the clowns to, so they'll be less funny, I suppose. And there's another thing where the patient is feeling lightheaded, and so if the patient is feeling lightheaded, they'll have a giant light bulb on top of their head, and so you need to create the system that will replace their light bulb heads with human heads. And so I thought that was wonderful and funny. And this game really does have a great, unique blend of humor, and I thought that was wonderful. Also, there's great audio that occasionally will play some funny jokes and things that I think help keep the player involved as well. So those are all really quite lovely. But I did want to say, when it comes to optimization, it's a little bit hard to find those fine details when it comes to the information there. Yeah. Okay, other notes. Yeah, I just wish the game progressed a little bit faster. That's the biggest problem here. There's a lot of cool things, but I wish they were coming a little bit faster to me, particularly if I show the aptitude to do so, or if I desire to bring that on. And another note here is that I find whenever I'm dealing with one of these kind of games where it is an economy simulation, I am always trying to see how does the game deal with players who are really, shitty, players who are really dumb, idiots maybe. If they find themselves in a situation where they're millions of dollars in debt, what does the game do to help them out, to set them on the right path? Can you get a loan? In this game, you can get a loan, but you can only get one. And so what happens if you go below that? Are you in sort of a no-win situation where you can only hire doctors? I feel like that's a really good way to evaluate these kind of simulation games. Or, I think it's always a good idea to have something like a declare bankruptcy, where you could declare bankruptcy, and maybe that does mean restart, but maybe that means you could start from where you are, but you could just sell off some rooms or something like that. I think there should always be a way for the player to crawl back to success, even if they are millions and millions of dollars in debt. And I think one of the things is, if you are millions and millions of dollars in debt, which seems a little silly in this game, but it's happened to me in City Skylines, I think there should be a bankruptcy button. You push it and immediately you're at 0 debt. And maybe there's some serious repercussions there, or you can only gain 2 stars on this level versus the normal 3 because you're such an idiot and you're such poor management. But I think there always needs to be a way for the player to come back, because if the player feels like they're absolutely hopeless, they might feel that restarting the level is hopeless, and that's a prime time for a player to leave and never come back to your game. So that's another concern there. But as I wanted to touch on before, I had this unique situation where I was actually challenged to collect 3 ghosts. And so I was talking a little bit about the humor there. One of the funny things that happens here is if the player dies, a ghost will start haunting the hospital. And so you need some of your janitors to be trained in ghost collection, which I thought was lovely. Certainly taking a page out of the Sims, maybe Sims 4 or 5, I don't know. Playbook where they do a lot of funny stuff like that with respect to player death or character death. And so that was quite lovely, but the problem was that my people weren't dying. And so there's sort of these 2 meters there, which is the player happiness and the player health. Oh, sorry, I say player, but I mean one of your patients. It's a patient health or patient happiness. And so the problem was that my patients were unhealthy, but they were very unhappy. And so they would leave if they're not happy. Whereas if they're unhealthy, they die. And so I faced a really interesting situation there, which I thought was a lot of fun, which is that I needed to make sure they were happy so they would stay, but unhealthy so they would die. And so that was a tough parallel there, because whenever they'd get unhealthy, they'd be unhappy and they'd want to leave before they die. But I'm like, no, 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 you have to stay happy. It's all okay. Be happy, be happy. And then they would die. So that was a tough balance to get right. And I felt like I just didn't have enough tools to evaluate the different factors that were contributing to either of these metrics. And so I felt a little frustrated there. I felt like I didn't have enough resources to influence that. For example, it wasn't like I would think if I could remove the food, then they would starve and they'd die. However, if they were thirsty, that made them very unhappy. And so I felt like that would have been something to affect their health meter. And so I added a lot of video game consoles because I thought, oh, video games, that'll make them really happy. But I found like they weren't really engaging with that. And so I thought there could have been some really fun trade-offs, even with some maybe implicit social, like social messaging of like, oh, if you give them the super salty snacks, they will be very happy, but very unhealthy. And so just sort of having trade-offs there. But I didn't really find there was that level of decision making going on, so I was a little disappointed to say that. So this game is going to be a medium recommend. It's the first media that I'm going to be recommending on this channel, which I'm really excited about because the last projects haven't been, I think, at the level that I'd recommend it, but I would recommend this for you. I think it's a lovely to spend maybe an hour or two. It hasn't hooked me for more than that, but it may resonate with you, and you may find yourself enjoying many more hours. There's certainly a lot of levels here, and I'm sure people have spent tens of hundreds of hours on this thing. And in terms of a score, I would say this is a strong 4 out of 5, maybe leaning towards a 4.5 out of 5. I think I'll give it a 4.5 out of 5. There's a few things that are preventing it from being a 5 out of 5 in my book, but I would say it's a really lovely, pleasant experience, and it does have, particularly with those social features, a bunch of experiments with respect to game design, particularly social game design, that I think could be really interesting to see further explored in the medium. So I'm excited to see what else is going on in this genre, which I haven't visited a lot. It's not quite a happening genre, but if this is the promise of games to come in this genre, I'm really excited about it. So this is 2 Point Hospital. Give it a try, and if you have, let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below.